Katie Griffin. I'm a senior staff attorney at Public Knowledge, work on telecom and copyright and IP. And this panel is going to be about 3D printing and small businesses and how the 3D printing industry relates to the little guys, to small businesses. And here, I mean, there's both 3D printing companies that are small businesses, but there's also how does 3D printing help small businesses when the small business is the user, when the small business is the buyer. There are lots of ways that this impacts our policies that want to encourage small businesses and make them more sustainable. So we have a great panel here, and my first question is going to be to just introduce yourselves. Who are you? What do your companies do? And how are you a small business yourself? Do you work with small businesses? How are you related to the small business issues?
Hi, my name is Martin Delise. I'm general counsel of a company called FormLabs. We're located in the Boston area, and we make and sell 3D printers, the Form 1 Plus primarily. The company was started by some graduate students at MIT who thought that 3D printers were too inaccessible for everyone, small businesses, individuals, a whole class of people who did not have at the time, hundreds of thousands of dollars that it cost for very high quality stereolithographic 3D printers, which is what my company makes. We sell one on our website for $32.99. I don't say that by way of advertising, but as a way of comparison of the massive price difference that we brought to the market, which we think is incredibly important for small businesses that want access to this kind of technology, that they don't have to fork out capital level expenditures, that it's much more of an individual cost. We ourselves are a small business, however. We are less than 100 people. We've grown very quickly. We started off of a Kickstarter launch, more or less, and have grown by leaps and bounds. And as a small business, we get hit by a lot of different forces that affect us, and our customers, because they are often small businesses, are hit by the same. So we have a lot of, I guess, visibility into some of the regulatory and political issues that do affect small businesses.
My name is Duann Scott. I'm not with a small business at the moment. I'm with Autodesk. We're a software company, but we like to help small businesses to grow. Particularly, we have now a new Spar platform, which is our 3D printing platform, which is a series of open API tools that anyone can use to leverage to enable 3D printing. So what we hope is that by releasing this free software for others to use, they can specialize in different areas and we can do the generic things. So people aren't reinventing the wheel every time they need to bring a product, a hardware, software or material to market. We also have, as part of the Spar platform, we have an investment fund of $100 million to invest in small to medium-sized businesses, probably small businesses, so we can grow their 3D printing ecosystem to help others, because we can't do everything. So our fund is to invest in software, materials and hardware to build out the 3D printing ecosystem so others can then continue to grow it. And that's what we're hoping to do. Right, Autodesk guys at Shapeways, which also was enabling small businesses through 3D printing.
Great. So to step back a little bit more generally, what impacts does 3D printing have on small businesses, and what are the different ways that small businesses can use 3D printing?
I think when you look at a small business that's going to get into particularly the manufacturing sector, you have to understand just how expensive and complicated it is to make even the simplest thing. The toaster that sits in your kitchen is the product of multiple revision cycles. It's the product of industrial design, it's the product of engineering, and almost every one of the intermediate steps between that going from the back of a cocktail napkin to it going to being in the stores involved someone making a prototype. Historically, people made prototypes by hand out of materials that were in their shop. So maybe they had some metalworking tools. Maybe they, were able to carve it out of wood if that was it. And then you had the rise of mass manufacturing. So if you want to get something made inexpensively out of plastic, great, we can do that. We can make 100,000 runs of things for pennies a unit. The cost, though, is up front, because to make that run of 100,000 units for a penny a unit, you're going to spend tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars on a set of tools molds and dyes and things like that. And so you could never, as a small business, really prototype the way it was eventually going to be manufactured. You always had a remove from where you're going to be. 3D printing and the systems around it eliminate that in many ways. It's now, in a context of having a 3D printer, about as expensive for me to produce one as it is for me to produce 10. So I don't have to worry about making a run of 1,000 different units of something. The example that was given to me once was a clothing designer, small business making clothing, who was very accomplished in making prototypes, in this case sort of clothes, by hand, cutting fabric, stitching it together, seeing how that looked. Is that what you wanted? No, let's iterate, let's redesign. But couldn't do it for buttons. To get buttons, this designer was going to have to go and order, I think it was something like 2,000 buttons from a company in China. It was going to take a long time and cost a great deal of money. And this was all just so that he could see what the button he wanted actually looked like on the clothing. With a 3D printer, he printed out a button in an afternoon. It wasn't what he wanted, so he printed out another that evening. And by the next day, he had the button he wanted for the clothing. So that's a way in which, I'm sure if you're Levi's, there's a department that could help you make a button quickly. But if you're a small designer sitting in a studio in New York, now you have a 3D printer. You don't need that giant department. So I think that's, in the prototyping space, one incredible way that 3D printers have expanded opportunities for small businesses. And then increasingly what we're seeing is that 3D printers are getting into the value chain as the final production object. That's sort of the new thing. People have been using 3D printers for prototyping for the better part of 20 years. But increasingly you're seeing customers want objects that are truly one-offs, a customized cell phone case or something like that. And in that case, even though it is much more expensive to produce the object with 3D printing, it still is much better than using traditional techniques to make one. So that's the way I see 3D printing as really enabling a lot of experimentation and innovation that previously was quite expensive, if it was even accessible.
Yeah, in that it levels the playing field for the speed of innovation. So all the big design firms have access to 3D printers in their studios. Whereas now, a up-and-coming designer who's just graduated can afford a $3,000 machine and pump out super high-end prototypes that compete with Frog or IDEO. And so when their ideas are presented just as well as those of the existing design firms, they can compete and maybe get a gig that would be far beyond what they could previously. They're not doing phone call cutting out and nastiness. And so we see, like, the dream of the desktop printer in every home is kind of bunk. But the idea of a desktop printer in every studio or everyone who's doing design or manufacturing or prototyping totally makes sense. And it's sped up so much. So people previously using a design bureau would wait between 2 weeks to even longer, depending on the material, if you're doing metal even longer. But the fact that you can have a desktop machine in your studio and do something within the hour is phenomenal. So that really, really speeds up innovation. You solve your mistakes really fast and you make better products for that.
And to follow up on that, do we have a sense of the uptake for small businesses in 3D printing? How many businesses have been using 3D printers? Is it growing? Where are those businesses?
Yeah, the growth is huge, but there's sort of three things that need to come into play together at the same time. There's software, hardware, and materials. So we can have all the best top-end 3D printers on someone's desk, but if you can't 3D model, it's as good as dust because you can't make anything. So we need to educate people on how to design. We need to improve the material palette, so we're not just using a plastic or just using a certain subset of materials. We need to really evolve this. And part of what's making this grow is by open source and free things. So we saw the explosion of FDM machines happen because of the patent expiring for the FDM process, fused deposition modeling. So once that happened, we saw the cost of those machines drop to a tenth, maybe less. But more importantly, we saw the palette of materials explode. So previously there was just ABS plastic and maybe some variation upon that. But 4 years after the patents expired, we probably got 60 material options for FDM. So I don't remember what the question was.
You're doing great. Just keep going.
So by opening and freeing things up and letting things move a little bit faster, we see greater variation of materials process and software. And when we see different material opportunities, we can make different products. So if we're just stuck to these monopolies of software, hardware, and materials, then we won't see the innovation we need to move this forward as quickly as possible.
I think, the growth of use, there's no question that more and more small businesses are taking up 3D printing. I don't have numbers, I'm not sure if there's numbers on that specific segment, but there's no question it's growing. I do think one of the things that's interesting that's happening now are people are realizing that they are 3D designers when they never knew it. Duann makes a really good point, which is if you can't create a 3D model of the object you want to print, the printer is useless to you. And so for a long time it meant that people who were CAD users, like engineers who are making other designs, that was the great user of the 3D printer. They had it right there, they could just print it. What I think is starting to happen with small businesses is more and more discovering that even though they're not using CAD tools, they are generating 3D content that has value if they can print it. Architects are a really great example. Architects have been creating 3D models of housing literally since first architect. They've been doing it with foam or wood or different media. Now, as increasingly they're moving on to computerized tools for floor plans, it's, I think, a very natural evolution to say, now that I have this 3D content, let me move now to a 3D printer with it. Dentists, an industry you wouldn't think of maybe as generating lots of 3D content, generates enormous amounts of 3D content that can be used in all sorts of different ways. With some concerns with the FDA, as we saw in an earlier panel. So I think one of the big growth aspects are people realizing that they have 3D data, that it's data which could be and perhaps should be printed, and then putting the tools in their hands, which I agree is very important, that they can take that content and actually move it into the physical world.
And so I heard open source come up a little bit in those answers. Can you expand a little bit on the relationship between open source and learning to design and using 3D printing?
So I guess what we've seen, as we saw with the open source machines, FDM machines, we're seeing some tools which are either open or open source or free for 3D modeling design. And then there's repositories of 3D files, designs to be modified. So the more content there is to share, the more that people can learn easily. So when I was at design school, the best thing to do was to get somebody else's CAD file with permission and look at how they designed it. You understand what processes you go through to make a good design or how they solve this problem with a certain structure. If we can have libraries of these sort of structures, and then we can sort of think of PowerPoint. If you're going to make a PowerPoint presentation and you had no template and no clip art, you're going to have black text, white background, a few photographs, yeah? If you've got a beautiful template, then you can quickly drop stuff in and make it happen fast and it look like you know what you're doing with PowerPoint. The same could be true with 3D modeling. We can need some templated stuff so you can have some basic structures, have a mic clip, have a stand, modify some components, have a custom thing exactly to meet your needs so you can have your water bottle sitting there. Useless scenario? Yes, but the idea is if we have these templates, we can move forwards quicker. And if we share those openly, then we can learn from each other and make a scientific, rather than just trying to control things.
I think open source in the 3D printer movement is a little more complicated than sometimes it's acknowledged to be. There's no question that open source 3D software is popular and will continue to grow. In part, that's because the closed source alternatives, such as your company makes, really quite expensive. There's an increasing push to make them available to more people, and lots of subscription plans to do that, but you're still talking about software. I'll give you an example. SolidWorks is a very popular tool for engineers. You're talking about many thousands of dollars per year per user under most of their pricing plans I'm aware of. That's a lot of money. To the extent that open source can provide an alternative to that, then obviously more people can then use that kind of tool. Those tools are very difficult to write. They're not easy. Part of the cost is the sheer number of man hours that go into creating that kind of code. But there's certainly room, I think, for open source to make lots of contributions there. Open source of the machines, I think, is a lot more complicated than people sometimes think. We've seen a couple of examples in the industry that started out as open hardware that found, for one reason or another, that their business model took them away from that, so they had to close the model. But even the companies that are open hardware, there is a real issue, I think, as to whether or not the norms that that community has created are actually things that are legally enforceable. In the open source movement, you have a strong background of copyright law, and based off that copyright law, you have licenses, and those licenses tell people, look, if you're going to take my work, then you're going to have to make your work available as well. At least that's one kind of open source license. With open hardware, it's very difficult to know if that actually is enforceable. It probably is not, I think, if you ask a lot of lawyers. And the difference is because it's a physical object that's functional instead of software that's subject to copyright. So as we see the current generation of companies that are open hardware continue to mature and grow, I wonder to what extent they will stay open hardware, particularly when they find that there is a 100% clone of their machine for half price coming from a distributor overseas or even inside the United States that just doesn't have their costs to do innovation. And it does cost something to do innovation. So I do wonder if that is something that will continue, or if we'll see maybe the software and content maybe stay open, but hardware not. And I suspect that is in fact what we'll see.
So that makes me curious. But it sounds like at the moment, at least for some parts of the community, it sounds like open hardware norms are still existing, even if they may or may not be enforceable. And it makes me curious, why is that? How did that develop?
Probably miseducation. The same way that people using Creative Commons licenses for functional objects kind of doesn't work. That we kind of have this group hallucination that it's how things work, and then at some point someone just bursts a bubble and.
Is that we just do that?
I don't know, probably.
This is the bubble bursting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's subtle, right? You have, everyone thinks, oh, okay, I'm giving you permission to copy me. But giving you permission to copy me only matters if I have the right to keep you from copying me in the first place. With software, you do. With a machine, unless you have a patent, probably not.
Yeah, we saw that there was a lawsuit in Canada that someone threw money at to go away, even though there was clearly no rights in a functional object. We'll learn.
Okay, so for FormLabs, as I understand it, you had this hugely successful Kickstarter campaign, and then you were hit with a patent lawsuit at one point. Could you explain, how did that happen? How did you handle it? Taking lessons from that example, what could make it easier from a policy perspective for the next FormLabs type company that's in that kind of situation?
Sure. There's a limited amount, obviously, I can comment about it. I think most of the basic facts are pretty well known. We had, as you said, a very successful Kickstarter, and then shortly after the end of the Kickstarter, both FormLabs and Kickstarter, I think a fact that sometimes people have forgotten, were sued together by really one of the dominant players in the 3D printing industry, 3D Systems. And they alleged that we had infringed a patent. They later dropped that patent and alleged that we had infringed other patents. I think the single most interesting thing about that experience is how long it takes. From the day that we learned that we were being sued to the day it was resolved was almost exactly 2 years. And the irony is, if you look at what happened in that case, as far as sort of major landmarks in a litigation, we hadn't even cleared the first hurdle. Maybe got to the second hurdle. So that's probably not typical. That may be sort of towards the bad end of the spectrum. But I think one of the issues in the patent system, and I do think there are many, I think there's a lot of reform that could and should be done that would help small companies. But I think one thing that has to be appreciated is just how long these things go on for. And that has a lot of effects. One effect of that is just the sheer cost. Even if it's proceeding very slowly, if you have to have outside counsel, you tend to find something to do every month. You have them on salary. So even if it's a very quiet 2 years, that does add up quite a bit.
What's your background?
I used to be an IP litigator. So I guess I know wherefore I speak. The other thing is that small businesses are growth machines. They don't exist staying stable normally. If you see one being stable, it probably means they're failing and you just haven't figured it out. They grow. They grow by raising money, sometimes through their product sales, sometimes probably more often these days through venture capitals and things like that. Having a lawsuit out there, even if it's totally without merit, is a lead anchor on both of those things. I can't tell you how many times we'd go to a trade show and someone would say, I hear you're being sued. And that's not even speaking to what happens when you try to raise money online. So just having these things outstanding, even if they are meritless, and I'm not making a comment one way or the other in that, but just the existence of it is problematic. So the ability to resolve things more quickly, I think, is a lesson that everyone should probably take some heart to, is that we need some system there. I think in general, there's a lot of reforms we can make to the patent system. I think the Innovation Act is a really good idea that's being reintroduced, I know, in some form this session. And it does a lot of things that should speed up the process. Some of you may be aware of it. It requires more detailed pleading so that someone's actually explaining to you why they think you are infringed. I should add that at the time that we were sued for patent infringement, we had not shipped a single machine to anyone. There was no one outside of our company that had any more information than a Kickstarter video. So it was a little curious to us how anyone would even think that we were infringing because they couldn't even see the machine. One of the things that the Innovation Act looks like it will do is make that kind of behavior a little more difficult to carry out. These are things that would help companies like us, because there will be more companies like us, there's no question. You know, Kickstarter has made it a lot easier for, I don't want to say unsophisticated, because that's not the right concept, but it's made it a lot easier for people who previously would never have thought about getting into the business world to all of a sudden start relatively substantial businesses with a lot of funding. And we've seen a lot of disasters that way, where nothing ever ships. But we've seen also a lot of pretty spectacular successes, like Oculus or something like that. But once you get that money, once you have that spectacular Kickstarter, well, now everybody's going to come looking at you, and many of them will have patents or other griefs that they want to put on your doorstep. And to the extent we can make it easier for companies to get over that hurdle and get on with business, I think that's good.
No comment.
So you mentioned, so while we're talking about patents, let's dig into that a little bit more. You mentioned the Innovation Act and the demand letters. Are there other patent policies that are impacting small businesses in 3D printing, and any recommendations that you would make?
This is not my area of expertise, to be honest. I'm the business.
Earlier this month, I think it was April 7th, the U.S. Patent Office issued patent number 9 million. They are sequential, more or less. So there are more or less 9 million patents out there that have been issued. I don't remember the statistics, but the vast majority of those are actually still in force, with the uptick in the number of patents that have been filed. If you have an idea, normally you want to know if anyone else had that idea first. You just want to know that, because if nothing else, you might want to see how they solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And so you go onto Google, or you go to your library, you ask around, and you try your best to find that information. I can guarantee you, you won't find all the relevant patents, at least in certain fields. It's too hard. There's no way. You can't pay someone to sit and read 10,000 patents. They are abstruse beyond human endurance. They're written by lawyers who talk to engineers. So you can imagine that the clarity of the prose is a bit lacking. And frankly, you have to do it that way. You have to write them in a certain way, because that's the way courts will expect them to be doing it. And you can't just look at the figures either, or look at the title, or even, you can't even look at the abstract, because the abstract doesn't even actually have to have much to do with what the patent actually covers. So if you're a small business and now you want to know, am I going to infringe a patent? I'm not sure there is a dollar figure you can spend to have certainty about that. I don't think there is. And the dollar figure you have to spend to have even a good idea is many, many tens of thousands of dollars for relatively straightforward patent searches. I don't think that is a tolerable situation. If that is going to be the situation, then I think the patent infringement rules and the way we think about what patent infringement means, I think we're going to have to eventually revisit that and maybe say, okay, this could be more like copyright, where the problem isn't so much that you did the same thing someone else did, it's that you copied them. That's not required under the patent system. And that may be something that maybe some of you are surprised at. I find that I talk to people who are surprised about this. If you sit in a room and you come up with an idea and you patent it, and I've never talked to you, I've never seen your idea, and I've never seen your patent, and I come up with the same idea, I could be infringing your patent. So that's why the search costs are such a really important thing, I think, about getting your small business started and growing your small business. But at the same time, I want to be fair about this. Patents are incredibly important to small businesses to grow. For whatever reason, venture capitalists do not want to talk to you until you have a patent. They just really aren't interested. They want to see that you have some claim to exclusivity in the market you're addressing, so that it's worth putting money in. And you need that money to hire people and continue to innovate. So I'm certainly not an absolutist when I say that we should reform patents, that they should have no value. They should, they need to. But I do think we need to be a little more careful to go after bad actors, as opposed to actors that just can't afford the lawyers it takes to review 9 million patents.
Okay, so to shift gears a little bit, and we'll get back to more policy recommendations. But for Autodesk, you mentioned earlier that you have this fund that you use to invest in small companies. I have a bunch of questions about that, so I'll ask them all at once. How does that work? Why did you set it up? What kind of opportunities does this open up for small businesses?
Okay, so the way it works is that we have set aside $100 million. It means we could spend more or less, and we have no time frame which we're going to spend it. We're probably about 3 or so years. The way it works is we have an online portal where you can submit some very, very basic information, and from that we sort of distill between the crazy delusional people who want to make drones to kill poachers, literally, through to what might be an interesting investment in the space. And what we're looking for are people who are building into the ecosystem, which is materials, hardware, software, or service, which helps grow the 3D printing ecosystem. So from that, we'll evaluate it. We'll look and see whether you have any patents in place, so you have a defensible idea, and then we will strike a deal about investing for equity in the business for a certain amount of capital, basic stuff. But it's not primarily a venture raising gain for us, for the shareholders. What it is about driving innovation and demand for the additive manufacturing space, so we can see more people building into it, more businesses growing, and having a more diverse ecosystem to, so see more interesting things happen.
Cool. So at this point, I'll open it up to any audience questions if we have any. If not, I will just keep covering. Yes.
How does one apply for that?
To apply for the fund, you go to autodesk.spark.com, and there'll be a big button that says fund.
Yes, in the back there.
Yes. My name is R. Bogosian. I have a 3D Hubs in Virginia. I also have a FormLabs printer, a great printer. I would have purchased the new Autodesk one, but it seems a bit small. At the trade show last week, I saw a lot of competitors out similar to FormLabs, and I was just curious if you could tell us if you were planning to sue any of them.
Well, if I was, I probably couldn't tell you. No, there's a lot of competition in this space, and I think competition in this case is very healthy. Like I said, it's exactly what I said before. Patents are important. If you do invent something, people shouldn't be able to copy your invention. But at the same time, I think we need to have a pretty high bar for what we think is a patent that's worth doing that on. If I was aware of somebody who took something we did, I certainly wouldn't be concerned about that. I hope that would never come to a suit. That's a disaster. No sane human being wants to end up in a patent lawsuit. Not the patentee, not the alleged infringer, because it's just pain and misery for everyone involved. There is a lot of patent licensing, and I think that's part of the line.
And that would be at a certain scale to make it worth your while.
Absolutely. We have bigger fish to fry. We'd rather outcompete and have bigger build platforms than our competitors.
Yes, towards the back.
Yeah, hi. So we've talked in the last 2 panels about IP space and copyright space. I'm wondering, maybe perhaps especially for small businesses, is the trademark area something that could be utilized especially? How does that fit in with the physical object and use rights?
I don't understand the questions. Please repeat that, sorry.
Yeah, I know some people are looking at trademarks as a way to try to get some rights restrictions on physical objects. Yeah. And I'm wondering if that's an avenue that could be useful for small businesses in particular, given the cost of getting patents and maybe the ease with which you get trademarks.
Yeah, I guess the thing about a trademark is it doesn't affect the functionality of the product. So it doesn't help you to defend a product, it just helps you to market it and prove that it's yours. Like we saw at Shapeways that it's kind of a way to prove your brand. It doesn't allow any functionality that adds value, kind of thing.
Yeah, our machine is visually very distinctive. I think it's got the big orange cover on the top and pretty special shape. And in fact, it's protected by a design patent, which is a kind of IP that you can get on that. There is a kind of trademark protection called trade dress that is also relevant for that sort of use. The problem tends to be that trade dress is not registered, and to prove that you've established trade dress is, again, a very expensive and difficult proposition. So my guess is if you're talking about somebody who is selling a knockoff Form 1 and saying, hey, this is the FormLabs Form 1, yeah, trademark's a great tool for that. Somebody who has made something that looks just like our printer and is calling it the My Printer, it's not a great tool, I think, for that. It is a possible tool, but I don't think it's a particularly efficient tool for small businesses.
Thank you.
Third row there?
So you've talked about how 3D printing can help small businesses that are innovators and manufacturers. Is there any way for it to be used for a small business that's a vendor, for example, like a game store, or?
Absolutely. The people are interested in 3D printing in a way that they just aren't about other technologies. Witness, you're all here on a policy talk about 3D printing. Lawyers are fascinated. I go to talk to lawyers all the time who want to know about IP and 3D printing, and they're not even IP lawyers. So consumers really do care. And in part, that's just because there's a lot of buzz, but also it's just an interesting technology. And so I think to the extent that retailers and vendors start incorporating 3D printing into their product offerings or even their marketing strategy, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a cooking store near where I used to live that was offering a service for a while where they printed custom cookie cutters for you around the holidays. Now, was that a profitable business for them? I highly doubt it. But I'm sure it was a great way to get people interested in into the store.
Yeah, and for someone who does stock something that is an intent as a quarterly product, it's super agile, so they don't have to put the order in for 10,000. They can just make 20 a week and sell them. They don't have inventory on the shelves collecting dust. If they've got a part which sells once every 3 years, they make it once every 3 years. So in that manner, it's really, really powerful. And as we see the evolution of materials and the higher quality machines come through, then we'll see that happen more and more. Like dentists do it. They'll print your teeth on demand. They don't have a rack full of teeth because that would be creepy.
I see one kind of towards the aisle there.
Okay, so staying on the theme of public policy, any comments on dealing with the SBA or SBIR programs?
We don't. The friction and overhead to discover what programs are out there and to jump through whatever hoops there are, as a small, fast-growing business, there are better sources, at least it seems to people. Maybe that's a marketing issue. Maybe if I really dug in, I would feel differently. But no one talks about the SBA or SBIR it doesn't come up, is the short answer as a place for programs. More often, negative government regulation comes up, not positive. Immigration law comes up for us all the time. We talk all the time about why can't we hire this candidate, why do we have to get rid of this candidate. We don't so much talk about how can the government help us grow our business. No one really has a lot of optimism there.
Towards the left there, I see a question.
Yeah, as a small business, I mean, when you file a patent, there's a hefty price that comes with it. It's 30 to 50 grand to file a patent for a small business. And even then, when you file it, it's for just one country. And, as we mentioned with cloners, as a company that has paid for all its IP, it covers you in a single country, and somewhere else in the world, someone comes up with an identical product as yours. How do you respond to that?
I did it before, it's like outperform.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge issue, and Outperform, unfortunately, is the best of the solutions, I think, because it is. I think you could do better than $30,000 to $50,000, but it's expensive. There's no question.
Sure.
And it is one country at a time. So if you want to start having a comprehensive IP policy, you have to end up going all over the world, and it's just not affordable for small businesses. That is true. I think the bigger issue is very often the patent that you have, even in the United States, it may be too expensive for you to enforce it even in the United States. So let's say that I can wave a magic wand, and now you can get a patent in every country on earth for $10, which I think would be a terrible one. But if you could,
Like domains.
yeah, if you could, it still wouldn't necessarily fix the problem, because if I have a cloner that's located in Taiwan, or I have a cloner that's located in Mexico or Canada or wherever overseas, the cost for me to retain local counsel, learn what that local legal system is, seek to get a judgment, enforce the judgment, these are very expensive processes, very distracting to a small company. Bigger fish to fry. Would rather have a better product with that time in mind.
Great, I think, oh, okay, well, one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Is that me?
Yes, that's you.
Okay, so I thought the Spar program was awesome because in the past there were just piles and piles of open source code to sift through until the APIs were a possibility. But the thing is there's still that extra step when we have small businesses in software in the 3D printing industry, having to communicate with all the different types of hardware that's just been exploding by the day. I guess the general question is how do software and hardware in small business and 3D printing play nice in the future?
Okay, so one of the hopefully benefits to Spark platform is that we will have the protocols for each of those machines.
Okay.
Both self-serve from those machines can just connect to our protocols, or we may develop it with them depending on the scale of the company and how many machines have out in the wild. So in the end, you can write the software and we'll handle all the rest of it. So that should play nice.
Is that in the works right now, or is that?
It's happening now.
It's happening now. Okay.
This has nothing to do with your question, but there's one policy point I didn't make. If there's anyone in the room who has the power, I plead with you, if you want to do one thing to help small businesses in the 3D printing space, fix high-skilled immigration. We have students coming out of MIT who want to work for us, who have incredible skills, and cannot do so. Or if they do, they can only do so for a very limited amount of time and have to leave this country. 3D printing is an international discipline. There are skilled people all over the world. And if I was sitting in Germany, I could have access to people from all over the world. Sitting in the United States, I can't. It's a massive, massive problem.
So on the last notes of playing nice and massive problems, and this is a question, please join me in thanking our panel.